Atas kehadirannya, selamat pagi, salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Terima kasih Pak Yosef, Pak Anas, Pak Alif, Pak Maika, dan rekan-rekan dari Sebijak Institute dan Forest and Society. Salam sehat semua. Pada pagi hari ini kita berkesempatan yang sangat luar biasa untuk bisa menyelenggarakan sebuah webinar series. Dan seperti Bapak Ibu dapat dilihat di poster yang telah kami edarkan, bahwa kali ini kita akan mendatangkan salah satu speaker dari University of Washington, Dr. Rebecca Darminarcek. Dan untuk tema kali ini sangat menarik. Mungkin sebagian dari Bapak Ibu semua ini adalah peserta online course kami, online course Environment Development and Governance, Theories, Issues, and Trends in Indonesia. Jadi kali ini kita akan banyak membahas mengenai adat, bagaimana konteksnya dalam politik kehutanan di Indonesia. Dan kebetulan Dr. Rebecca ini adalah salah satu expertnya dari University of Washington, seperti itu. Nah, langsung saja mungkin Bapak Ibu tidak menunggu lama lagi begitu. Jadi sebelum kita mulai acara webinar atau mungkin lebih intensif kita diskusi. Jadi mungkin Bapak Ibu dapat dilihat di screen. Yang pertama ini adalah ketentuan webinar kita kali ini. Ini agak sedikit berbeda. Jadi kita menggunakan nanti terutama untuk ketentuan sesi Q&A, question and answer. Jadi yang pertama mohon seperti biasa untuk ketentuan nama akun Zoom Bapak Ibu sekalian bisa diganti seperti yang tertera di screen. Kemudian Bapak Ibu harapannya supaya lebih interaktif juga dapat mengaktifkan video. Dan nanti untuk ketentuan diskusi, question and answer, jadi kita menggunakan fitur Jamboard dan nanti panitia akan mengirimkan linknya untuk di chat box. Jadi Bapak Ibu nanti ketika mengajukan pertanyaan, kita tidak menggunakan fitur raise hand ataupun Slido ataupun chat box, tapi menggunakan link jamboard.google.com. Jadi silakan nanti diakses di chat box masing-masing Bapak Ibu. Dan kemudian untuk acara pada pagi hari ini kurang lebih mungkin satu jam atau maksimalnya adalah 100 menit. Jadi kita tidak akan lama. Jadi mohon Bapak Ibu nanti kalau ada pertanyaan langsung bisa menuliskannya di Jamboard tersebut begitu. Mungkin itu saja sebagai pengantar dari saya. Dan sebelum kita mulai acara diskusinya, jadi mungkin saya ingin perkenalkan dulu bahwa untuk webinar series kita kali ini juga merupakan kerjasama dengan IVIS, American Institute for Indonesian Studies, dan juga Sebijak Institute dan Forest and Society. Nah, mungkin bagi Bapak Ibu ada yang belum mengenal apa itu IVIS dan bagaimana IVIS itu seperti apa konsennya. Nah, di sini mungkin kami undang Bapak Yosef Jakababa untuk memberikan sedikit pendahuluan sekaligus membuka Bapak. Jadi mungkin bisa diperkenalkan apa itu IVIS dan apa saja kegiatan IVIS. Mungkin singkat kami persilakan Pak Yosef.
Oke, baik. Terima kasih Mbak Lars dari Sebijak Institute. Welcome everyone for this opportunity. Nama saya Yosef Jakababa, saya country representative dari IVIS, American Institute for Indonesian Studies. Senang sekali pada pagi hari ini saya bisa hadir di sini untuk membuka acara webinar series The Cultivation of Customary Law in Indonesia's Political Forest yang nanti akan dibawakan oleh Bu Rebecca. Teman lama, sudah lama kita tidak bertemu ya Bu Rebecca. Apa kabar? Semoga baik-baik selalu. Ya, saya mewakili IVIS di sini. Senang bisa mendapat kesempatan ini. Dan terima kasih kepada Forest Society Research Group dari University dan Sebijak Institute dari Universitas Gajah Mada sehingga acara ini bisa berjalan dengan bisa dimulai pada hari ini, mudah-mudahan berjalan dengan baik. Kami IVIS dengan senang sekali mau untuk mensupport acara seperti ini. IVIS itu sendiri adalah singkatan American Institute for Indonesian Studies. Kami adalah organisasi sebuah konsorsium ya, yang tergabung dalam konsorsium ini ada 34 universitas dan institusi di Amerika yang mempunyai minat atau studi Indonesia. Studi Indonesia yang di fokus ini kebanyakan berasal dari ilmu sosial dan humaniora, tapi juga tidak tertutup bagi ilmu untuk tentang lingkungan maupun ilmu-ilmu sains lainnya. IFIS mempunyai program misalnya mensupport seperti acara seperti ini, seminar-seminar knowledge dissemination, dan juga capacity building. Kita pada saat ini juga masih membuka pendaftaran untuk workshop untuk menulis untuk penerbitan ke jurnal internasional. Ya, workshop yang nanti ada akhir. Kemudian kami juga akan menyiapkan sebuah konferensi, konferensi Indonesian Studies yang pertama secara virtual yang bekerja sama dengan Michigan State University. Ini kalau saya diperkirakan, kalau boleh saya share ininya alamat email, alamat websitenya. Konferensi International Indonesian Studies ini adalah yang pertama virtual dan akan dilakukan bersama Michigan State University. Deadline untuk abstrak itu, sebentar saya share di chat link ya, jadi berharap teman-teman semua sini bisa. Deadline untuk abstrak itu akhir bulan ini, tanggal 31 Maret, kami menerima abstrak untuk individu, ya, bagi mau yang mendaftar konferensi ini, tapi juga abstrak untuk panel, jadi bisa membentuk panel juga. Topiknya apa saja yang berhubungan dengan Indonesian Studies. Dan yang ini konferensi internasional, ya, dan yang kami juga senang dan banggakan dari konferensi adalah presentasi boleh dilakukan dalam bahasa Indonesia maupun bahasa Inggris. Jadi ini kesempatan yang sangat baik menurut saya, dan sangat luar biasa bagi rekan-rekan akademisi di Indonesia dan juga di mana saja untuk bisa berpartisipasi dalam konferensi kami ini. Ya. Nanti ada biaya konferensi, tapi biaya konferensi tidak kami upayakan minimum lah, jadi banyak yang bisa hadir. Nah, ini yang mau hadir juga kalau misalnya tidak presentasi juga boleh untuk bisa mengunjungi panel-panel yang nanti, ya, kalau sudah siap. Jadi itu tanggal 23 Juni sampai tanggal 26 konferensi tersebut. Silakan, situ ada informasinya bagaimana cara mendaftarnya, harus menghubungi siapa, dan juga ada link untuk pendaftaran. Nah, itu sekian dari saya. Terima kasih atas kesempatan yang diberikan, dan saya ingin melihat banyak dari teman-teman sini yang nanti mendaftar dalam konferensi ini. Ya, baik, terima kasih.
Baik, terima kasih Pak Yosef. Jadi bagi Bapak Ibu tadi ya, ada conference antara IFIS dengan Michigan State University. Jadi Bapak Ibu yang pastinya penelitiannya tentang Indonesian Studies bisa apply begitu untuk diseminasi knowledge, dan nanti juga bisa hadir sebagai peserta. Baik, terima kasih Pak Yosef atas perkenalannya dari IFIS. Dan mungkin langsung saja karena waktu kita tidak banyak, so this is our discussion. Jadi ini adalah sesi diskusi, dan sebelumnya mungkin saya perkenalkan dulu siapa yang akan memoderasi diskusi kita pada pagi hari ini. Jadi mungkin bagi teman-teman yang kelas EDG tidak asing, ada Dr. Maika Fisher. Pak Maika nanti yang akan memoderasi secara langsung
kuliah
webinar kita pada pagi hari ini dengan judul The Cultivation of Customary Law in Indonesia's Political Forest. Jadi Pak Maika ini mungkin ada yang belum tahu background-nya. Jadi beliau dulu dari University of Hawaii, dan beliau salah satu political ecologist ya in the context of Indonesia, dan beliau sekarang juga menjadi salah satu editor-in-chief dari Forest and Society. Jadi bagi Bapak Ibu juga yang tertarik untuk submit ke jurnal beliau juga sangat dipersilakan. Mungkin tidak banyak, mungkin langsung saja Pak Maika. So welcome, we are inviting you and time is yours. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Selamat pagi semuanya di Indonesia, selamat malam bagi yang bergabung di Amerika Serikat. Saya senang sekali bisa memfasilitasi kegiatan hari ini. Just very briefly to extend kind of the early announcements to our English-speaking viewers. We're going to transition now to the English language portion of the show, but I just want to highlight, to say our thanks to Forest and Society and to Sebijak Institute, who have worked very hard to put on this class, environment, development, and governance. And it's great to see the students here today, and it's great to be able to open this up for a wider audience. And you heard from IFIS, from Dr. Yosef Jakababa, that there are increasing opportunities to share across cultures, to present both in Indonesian and in English on these really important issues. We're really fortunate today to have Dr. Rebecca Darrow-Minarchek to be our speaker. This is a theme that we've been engaging on the last couple weeks in our course on environment, development, and governance in Indonesia, in which we started from these issues of colonial perspective, right? And there's a lot of questions from the students in this class that is asked, what is the legacy of colonial legal systems in Indonesia today? And I think today is a really special occasion because we get to extend those questions into the contemporary issues, how that relates to today. I mean, in the past decade, if you've been interested on social environmental justice or just environmental issues in Indonesia, the question of adat has been front and center. And I just want to briefly highlight Dr. Minarchek's work, who has really worked on these issues at the intersection of very important issues, right? From agriculture perspective, working with local communities, to issues that cross into the forest estate, to just broader development issues, gender and food security, etc. For those in the class, I've shared her book chapter that is related specifically to the issues of adat related to legal recognition of indigenous land rights, adat communities' rights. So without further ado, this has been a long introduction. We have a lot of announcements because there's been so many exciting things going on. We hope that this momentum is sustained. We hope that maybe ideas for future panels at the MSU IFIS conference can emerge out of this discussion. And I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Minarchek to start a presentation. Please be monitoring the chat because we have a special way for participation today, which will be explained in further detail by Dr. Minarchek. So the floor is yours, and welcome everyone. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, am I on? Okay. Thank you everyone for being here. My evening, your morning. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm really excited to share this work with you, especially since I have not had that many chances since finishing my research to share with the Indonesian community. So I think that's a component that I've been missing. So I really look forward to your feedback and thoughts. And speaking of feedback and thoughts, I'm going to be using something that I haven't used before in a presentation. So I hope that it kind of goes smoothly, but that's called Google Jamboard. And you'll see in the chat there that there's a link to it. Basically what Google Jamboard is a whiteboard for online interaction. So when we have classrooms or presentations that we can't be together, that this is kind of a way that Google has come up with to still be able to share and collaborate interactively. So if you go to the link, hopefully you all have edit options. And I've just kind of up in the corner, you can see there's some designations of when you add a note. If it's just a comment that you would like to make, you can put that in yellow. And if you'd like to ask a question, it'll help if you put that in pink, so it'll kind of stand out. And if it's something that you just want clarification on, you can put that in orange. If you can't figure out how to change the color, don't worry about it, just put it up and we'll figure it out and we'll get it added. There are 3 pages because there are a couple of different times within the presentation. Perfect, whoever just did that. But as we go through, there are certain places within the presentation when we'll turn to the Jamboard and we'll kind of collaborate interactively. So that's why there's 3 different Jamboard pages on there. So with that, I am going to start doing screen share. And I hope you're able to see this. I have two screens going, and sometimes it's funny.
We're seeing a black screen at the moment.
Oh no. Can you see it now? Or is it still just black?
Not yet. You can click the mirror view in the presentation mode.
Now do you see it?
Not yet.
Still not. I might have to take off the dual screens. We'll see if it. Now I've lost everybody. All right. Yay or nay?
Not yet. If it would help, you can send it through and we can present it. That's just an option. Well, I'm still not seeing anything right now.
All right. Let's try one more time and then I'll email it or send the.
Still the same thing.
Still that black screen?
Yep.
What's the easiest way, Micah?
Just email it to me and I will share the screen.
Okay, hang on just a moment. In the meantime, if you want to play around with the Jamboard, I'm just kind of thinking about different questions you might have prior to it.
I think it'd be nice to get a sense of how you got interested in this topic while we're setting up the screen. Can you just tell us a little bit about your interest in Indonesia and how you found this topic as an introduction to start off?
Sure. So I started doing research in Indonesia, and I'm multitasking. So sorry if I started doing research in Indonesia back in 2008, and I continued to do research there through 2016. It's actually a little bit sad to me that I have not been able to visit Indonesia since 2016. And with that was due to like some, job stuff, but and finishing grad school and all that. But it's interesting to think also about the way that the pandemic is changing our ways that we do research. And so I think it's, in the future, we're really going to have to think about these virtual spaces as places to do research and not just, as ways to do some presentations or whatnot. I feel like there's not going to be as many opportunities to visit Indonesia, and that's very sad to me. But I think that with the pandemic and that we're having to think about that. Okay, I'm attaching, so hang on, let me send that to you, Micah. Okay. So I started doing research there, and I started doing research. I've done mostly work on the island of Java with some additional work in Central Kalimantan as well, looking at different agricultural projects. And so looking at issues of SRI rice cultivation in Central Java, also looking at agricultural production and associated farming and fishing activities with communities in Central Kalimantan. And then this research that I'm focusing on here for my dissertation was with the Kasapuan communities of West Java. So here in a moment, whenever the slides come up, then I'll be able to show you some of that area first off, I guess I can get started as we kind of go through, but I do want to apologize that I'm not able to give this presentation in Indonesian. Perfect. Thank you, Micah. Like I said, I haven't been back to Indonesia since 2016. I've kept up with the progress of different constitutional court rulings that I detail here in the presentation. Is there any way that you can make that into like because it'll show up with all my notes and stuff on there. So can you do like a full screen share? Perfect. Yeah. But in that time period, I've not kept up with my Indonesian language skills as much as I should have. So I really do apologize. That bothers me. And hopefully in the future, I'll be able to correct that. I'm currently, you can go to the next slide. I'm currently an assistant teaching professor at the University of Washington in Seattle. And I put my email address up there. I would love to, communicate with any of you who have some thoughts or would like to discuss this further, or if you're interested in doing similar research. I really am interested in communicating with you. So please reach out. I'm happy to talk more. The next slide, there's a lot of text here, but really what I want to point out is that these underlined sections, which what I'll be discussing today, is the contemporary remnants of colonial era policies. As Dr. Fisher mentioned, that there's a lot of questions about what are the lasting legacies of colonial era policies in Indonesia today. And so hopefully this presentation will highlight some of those issues and kind of what has lingered within these communities, especially confusing, conflicting, and or even at times corrupt statutory legal system in Indonesia, which has to some extent undermined itself by being so confusing and conflicting that it's really the ambiguity of that system has limited its impact. And so therefore communities really search for stability in customary law or adat law in order to govern everyday life. So on the next slide, you can skip the next one. It's just kind of like an introduction slide. Sorry, can someone forward the slide?
Maika?
I'll just keep chugging along. So the next slide, when you see it, it has 40 million on it. And the reason that there's a 40 million on that slide is that though that number represents the number of forest dependent people in Indonesia, and a majority of those are indigenous community members. And during my research in Indonesia, I worked with, obviously not all of the 40 million, but I worked with some of these 40 million indigenous peoples. And I was researching laws that were affecting, in some cases.
Sorry to interrupt. Are you seeing my slide change? I've been changing, but is it stuck on the same slide?
I only see the slide, but if other people can see the other ones, then.
No, I think I'm having issues with my screen sharing.
Maika bisa share ke kami.
Okay.
Do you want me to just keep going?
Yeah, I think you should keep going, and
Right.
I will reshare it in a second.
Okay. So what I was really looking at in this research was looking at the ways that certain laws were affecting or not affecting the lives of indigenous communities. I looked at historical trends in legal systems. I looked at current constitutional court rulings and also completed ethnographic research into the practices of customary law as it was happening at the village level. And really over and over again, what I kept seeing was these really promising laws being passed, or what I saw as very promising laws. But in reality, they changed nothing in the legal system, or they sounded very, very similar or exactly like a previous law. Or in the worst case scenario, some of these laws directly conflicted or conflicted with previous laws. So there would be two laws on the books, and they would be laws that directly conflicted with each other. So from my point of view, that's very confusing. And I think it's obvious from an Indigenous community member's perspective that was very confusing. How do you approach that when these laws are being passed? And to me, I feel very bad now that I thought this, but at the time when I was doing the research, I thought, why are these people just ignoring these laws? Why are they, like an ostrich sticking their head in the sand and ignoring it? But really what I was finding after I started doing the analysis is that these people were not sticking their heads in the sand and ignoring it. But really what was happening is their response was a lot more complicated than that. They were aware of...
The slides are up now, sorry.
Yeah, oh, you can go back. Yep, okay. They were aware of these changes that were happening, but there was a place in their mind in that, like, yeah, another law, another promise, another struggle. And that's where they were filing it back into. And so on the analysis, I started seeing how that was problematic. And so the paper itself is much more in depth regarding the case study and the Indigenous community. For the sake of this presentation, I'm fairly light on the details of the particular community, because the important thing that I want to bring to your attention here in the presentation is the legal history and how it's come to shape a very confusing, conflicting, and oftentimes corrupt statutory system. And perhaps even unintended, what that has done is simultaneously created a very strong customary law system within the country. So a very strong adat law here in Indonesia. Next, yeah, you can go on to the next slide. So looking at political forests, the reason that I used political forest as a unit of analysis within this paper is because I think through this class, many of you will know that forests are inherently political in Indonesia. You can see that through, how Peluso and Van der Geest define political forests here on the slide. There are many areas within Indonesia that are designated as forests that are no longer covered in trees. There are political forests, and in areas where historically indigenous communities have lived, but their lands have been, for a number of reasons, mined, turned into wet rice agriculture. They've been permanently settled. And whether that's by force, coercion, forced displacement, economic migration, there's a lot of different reasons. So I don't see my work as bringing the politics into forests, but rather recognition that the politics are already embedded within these spaces. So in this research, in this paper that this presentation is based on, I'm looking at the contemporary remnants of colonial era policies in forest law in Indonesia. And I actually go through a bit more of not just the colonial law, but also occupation as well, and then Indonesian independence, and look at the ways that those histories have compounded into the current system. So really sorry, you can go back one more. I'm giving your finger a workout, Micah, sorry. What I'm claiming here is that the creation of political forests in Indonesia has resulted in a pluralistic statutory system of law in the country, and as a result has strengthened customary law within indigenous communities. And because of this, I really believe that customary law will continue to be a relevant and necessary part of life for adat communities as long as the statutory system of forestry law in Indonesia remains so ambiguous. for this research, you can go on to Methodologies. And I'm just going to skim through these really quickly. If you have questions, we can, feel free to post those in the Jamboard. 308 structured or semi-structured interviews, 12 focus groups, and those focus groups were primarily with the indigenous communities. And then 89 land tenure surveys, and those were individual with community members. In that same vein, at the village level, there's also countless hours of participant observation, as anyone who's ever done ethnographic research will probably identify with. And then at the national level, I also looked at census data collected from the Indonesian Central Bureau of Statistics. And then also at the national level with national park officers, Ministry of Forestry officials, representatives from the Indonesian Human Rights Commission, because I was looking at some work that the Human Rights Commission did with Indigenous communities. So I attended quite a few of those meetings. And then also with representatives from NGOs that were working with Indigenous communities. So the actual group that I was looking at within this case is the Kasepuan and Gunung Halimun Salak National Park. The map on the following slide, because most of you are in Indonesia and you have a pretty good idea, I didn't include the larger Indonesia map, but this is in the southwest corner of the island of Java. So West Java, kind of on the border with Banten, and West Java there. Is that right? Yeah. Okay, so down near Pelabuhan Ratu. Sorry, Micah, can you go back to that one? And the reason I include this slide and not a larger map is because when we're thinking about the current remnants of colonial land law, Gunung Halimun Salak National Park is a very good example of this, because many times I would talk to the community members and I would ask them kind of what they thought of as their traditional territory. So as they were working towards land rights or access rights or whatnot, they one of the community members handed me a map of Gunung Halimun Salak National Park, and they said, this is our traditional lands. And so really they consider the national park territory is the national park on paper, but in their minds, it is their traditional territory, and they never left. And so they were there before Indonesian independence, they were there before the Dutch. And so in their mind, they should have rights to that land. Through using historical evidence and tracing remnants of the legal systems, it becomes really obvious that these people have never left their land, but yet they have no legal ownership over it. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to trace throughout this. That's the point of this whole research, is to trace these remnants of colonial land law in order to show that Indigenous communities have lived here and they're living under the remnants of all of these legal systems. So I'm going to take a pause right now, and we can head over to the Jamboard. There it is. And I just want to invite you to, if you have kind of lingering questions, you're not quite sure what area this is, you have a quick question about methodology, anything like that, I am happy to take a little breather and see if there's any questions. Are you all able to edit it?
Yes, Rebecca, it's quite clear. Thank you.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. Yeah, it's a really good question, the land uses. So, when we're talking about land rights, we're not just talking about land ownership. that there are lots of different ways to access. So as I'll get into in the, further along in the presentation, that there's a difference between access for hunting, access for mining rights, surface let rights. There's also water rights. There's also use rights for agricultural activities. And so the majority of rights are not recognized as ownership rights.
So there is a question raised in my mind, Rebecca.
The land rights, the different land uses?
Oh, yeah. There's the conflict of land use in your research area.
Yeah, so it's not just access. Yeah, there's a lot of different uses that are happening in the area. So it's not just agriculture. Some of you who are familiar with the area know that there's also some gold mining that happens. And so part of the research was looking at, yeah, I can do those too. But looking at small scale gold mining, especially because there were a lot of farmers who are using mercury to mine with the tailings, which is kind of problematic, and there has been issues of birth defects in the area, and older male members who had worked in the mines dying from Minimata. Do you guys know Minimata? Yeah. So which is just exposure, long-term exposure to mercury. So that happens quite a bit in the area as well. Okay, what are the different land conflicts? Yeah, I'm going to get into the land conflicts as we go along. Methods, because this is directly related to methods, the survey. So the land tenure survey that I created was one that I created myself, looking at some questions about land ownership, land use, looking at if community members had access to land, especially if looking at the difference between different social classes within the community. So which social classes, because, the community as a whole is not homogenous. There's very different characteristics even within the community. Some more powerful actors had access to land and some less powerful didn't. Also looking at gender. So do women have the same access as men? Inheritance, kind of questioning where they got their land from. Yeah, so if you guys are interested, I can share that at a later time, like after the presentation or so with Micah, and he can forward it on. But I think it's really important in this to understand that methods are somewhat fluid. You have to be willing to go into a community and communicate. And if things aren't working right in a survey, being able to tailor them to your needs. So I'm actually teaching a methods course this quarter, and that's one of our lessons that we went over, is being able to work with your methods if they're not working. And for example, in this survey, one of the issues is I kept using the word land ownership. And that's when it really hit me that they weren't owning the land. They were using the land, and they had ownership through Abba, who is the king figure for the community, but they didn't actually have like a surat for ownership. So that was one of the things I had to kind of tailor in the wording. Yes. Okay, so I think I covered that. I think I'll come back to this question. If somebody can cut and paste the politicizing forest lands in Indonesia compared with other Southeast Asia countries, maybe to a next one. And I think I'll cover that a bit more. Micah, do you mind popping the slides back up again? Thank you. All right, so I'm going to get kind of into more of the results section of those land tenure surveys, and also looking at the historical legacy of land law, I have heard that last week and this week you've really focused on presentations of historical Dutch colonial forestry law. So I won't go too in depth on that, but it also is important to make the connection between these different layers. And so, as you can see in 1830, that is when the cultivation system was put into effect in Indonesia. And the cultivation system was feudal in nature, and it required the population to contribute 1/5 of their land to growing export crops for colonial administration. Or if, in the case of many of these community members, they had no land, they were required to contribute their labor. So the system led to widespread poverty and famine, as landowners and laborers alike were forced to meet colonial production quotas before meeting their own needs. So what was happening was a tax system effectively became a forced labor system. In 1870, that was moved to the Agrarian Law. And this is important because I'm also going to look a little bit at the basic agrarian law within Indonesia, which is came about later with the new Indonesian independent government. But the agrarian law was a bit of rolling back of the cultivation system, and it was intended to formalize land holdings with titles for the local population. But as you can imagine, many of these community members did not have ownership rights. They had use rights or usufruct rights. And so with no formal title, they were dispossessed of their land rights, including many indigenous communities. Because the agrarian law included forest lands, adat land, village communal lands, private agricultural land, and native lands that were under use rights. So the Dutch seized any useful lands or resources from the local population without compensation. So in their mind, if it didn't have a formal title, it wasn't part of the agrarian law. And so the effects of this program are still being felt in Indonesia. Much of the land claimed by the colonial government more than 140 years ago, especially indigenous lands, now forms the bulk of the country's system of conservation zones for flora and fauna. So you can see how this is all kind of compounded, and this is not the case only within West Java, but many, and I would venture to say most, of the national parks within Indonesia are based on lands that were confiscated by the Dutch government during the agrarian law being implemented. And how this happened is in 1942 and 1943, really seems like a little, a small blip on the timeline. It's just 2 years. But actually these 2 years were really crucially important within forestry because there was, during Japanese occupation, of course, you can understand it's during the wartime, there was widespread deforestation, destruction, and violence suffered during this Japanese occupation. Therefore, the government of the newly independent Indonesia really idealized the Dutch model to some degree, and then reverted to the Dutch approach to forests when they took over. So with the Constitution written in 1945, so you'll see that, actually that's not on there, sorry, but in 1945. Consequently, the maps that were created of land and forest areas, national parks, that were created during the colonial regime took on a sort of definitive status, regardless of whether they were under dispute with the colonial government, which was the case with the Gunung Halimun Salak National Park maps. So during that time, during the colonial era, and the paper goes into more detail, those lands were, the community members within Gunung Halimun Salak National Park had asked the colonial government to reconsider the map territory, But when the Indonesian state took over, they just took those maps ad hoc and they didn't change anything about them. So the maps transferred, but the disputes didn't. So they took on kind of this definitive status. Then in 1960, the the Basic Agrarian Law went into effect. And this officially revoked the colonial era legislation of the Agrarian Law that had been passed previously by the Dutch. And it really did, it attempted to clarify the standing of customary law communities with regard to the nation's constitution. Adat was to be recognized in the law, but only if it was not in conflict with the statutory laws or the national government's plans for the development of national resources. So the new Indonesian government, through the Basic Agrarian Law, effectively made itself a landlord for communities across the country. Currently, you can see this is what this means for the communities is that they had no ownership rights. The statutory system has a very complicated system of rights, including rights to hunt, rights to cultivate, several distinct types of use rights, differing for forest land, non-forest land, national park core zones, non-core zones. It's very complicated. And so because all of these have compounded and kind of meshed together without really any sense of trying to clarify and for the communities. And so community members use a system of rights primarily in everyday life that's through their own adat system. So there's only 3 types of rights within this particular community. Other communities probably have very different ones, but within the Kasapuan, it is closed protected forests, entrusted forests, and use forest. Community members only have rights to cultivation in use forests. So it's a very straightforward system compared to the statutory system. And the other 2 categories, so the closed protected forests and the entrusted forests, are controlled by the king for the community, and those are largely conservation and sacred zones. It's really important to also point out within these systems that the adat forest zones often do not overlap or correlate to the national parks official zones. So within my research, I really had to be very specific with participants about which zones I was referring to, because if I asked, just the general, do you respect forest zones type of question, a villager may respond that they did, and then go and cut down a tree in the park's core zone, but fully within an adat use zone. So when asking a national park officer if the villagers respected forest zones, he may reply that they do not, since they cut trees in the core zone, but it's just because the different types of zones don't always overlap. And so you can see that it's a very confusing, oftentimes community members are jailed, or the king is required to pay a fine because the community members are cutting down trees. So kind of just to wrap this up, and then we'll head back over to the Jamboard and see if we have any lingering discussion. But it's the confusion of the statutory system throughout the colonial, independence, the New Order, and the modern era that's occurred through the compounding, conflicting national laws concerning forest use. Also, indigeneity plays a part, land ownership, resource access, but this has allowed for the growth, persistence, and legitimation of customary laws for many forest-dependent indigenous groups in Indonesia. And I think that will remain the case for many years, decades to come, until the statutory system can kind of clarify some of these lingering questions for indigenous communities. With that, we can head over to the Jamboard and see if there's some additional questions. And then after that, maybe we can open it up for discussion. I have not even looked at time. I have no idea. As Dr. Fisher could tell you, a little off on time tonight.
I think this is going really well. I think we're hitting on some of the really key themes. Can we go to the second page, Laras, of the Jamboard? Is this where people are populating? You asked me to move this one to this page, right? To address it later on the comparative Southeast Asia. We can still wait on that because a lot of new issues just came up from the really interesting last part of the presentation.
Yeah, let's maybe look at some of the other ones, and then we'll kind of move more broadly to Southeast Asia in general, because I've mainly done research in Indonesia and Thailand. I haven't done a whole lot. I did some comparison with Cambodia and also the Philippines in previous work, but that was all using primary sources and or archival documents. And so that wasn't, I'm not sure I could make those comparisons, but I was recently on an AAS panel, Association of Asian Studies, and the panel was comprised of people who were working in Indonesia and East Timor. And so I think there's actually quite a few overlapping issues between Indonesia and East Timor due to histories. You know, it was Portuguese there, but I think, and then also some Indonesian as well. And interestingly enough, because the Indonesian government to some extent really idealized the Dutch version of forest law and management, some of that actually went over to Timor. And so you can kind of start, you know, it's like checking a language or checking forest, you can kind of, or forest law, you can kind of see remnants of everything and how they compound. And you can start seeing that in East Timor. Do you think the integration of customary law to the forest conservation plan could be effective? You know, that's an interesting question. I would love to see adat incorporated more into statutory law. Is it possible? I'm not entirely sure. I think that's what the basic agrarian law was trying to do. But the problem with adat is that it is most times not written down. And so when you, I'm getting that feedback, sorry. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Okay. So when you start to codify adat law, I think is when you lose some of what makes it unique and amazing. And so there's a real problem with trying to integrate it into forest policy and official laws, because then we have to really think, is it adat anymore? Or is it just a snapshot of adat law in that given time and place? And I'm not sure I have the answer to that question, but you know, it's something we have to consider when we're trying to think about incorporating it. Yes, I love this question so much because, so the question is, can you talk a little bit about how adat systems have changed alongside the statutory phases? They're also working through the state systems as well. And this is so true, so true. I think what happens is that people tend to also idealize adat law. And so they think, oh, these, you know, adat communities, they are so special in this way. And then, you know, they tend to like pick out a very specific thing that they love about that particular community and idealize it to an extent, but yet not allowing or recognizing that adat systems change just as much as statutory law. And that's okay. And that's like perfectly fine. It's kind of the beauty of it is that it is so malleable. Within the community in particular, what I saw as the most interesting development, and this isn't so much about statutory law, but rather that the community over time had really pulled in a lot of pieces of Islam, whereas before they were very strictly, they did ancestor worship, and they still have a lot of those traces of ancestor worship and forest spirits and such. But over time, a lot more of Islam had come into the community, and so that was being incorporated into adat as well. And I found that just fascinating. So it's really important to remember that that flexibility of adat law is what makes it important to the community member's life, is that when you codify it into something, it loses its flexibility. It loses its ability to mesh with communities members as they are. Different initiatives to formalize adat law, and how has that changed adat law? So I'm not sure about initiatives to formalize. Within this particular community, there was a wall where they liked to write down, bits and pieces within, they call it imagade. So, like the central house where the king hosts visitors. And there was a wall there, and they had an initiative going where they would try to write down some of the, adat law that they thought was important for, people coming into the community to know. It was so new, it had just started happening, that there was no fixing adat passages on the wall. I will be really interested to, revisit the community in another 10 years and maybe another 10 after that, and see if that has changed, and to see if there is painting over top of painting, because I think it's really hard for communities to formalize adat law, but it's just very difficult. And maybe it's not adat any longer if it is formalized, if that makes sense. Based on your research, which country in Southeast Asia do you think has more open characteristics and accommodating customary law? Why some countries have better characteristics? I don't know if I'd call it better. I think one of the countries within Southeast Asia that has done amazing work at recognizing indigenous land rights is the Philippines. And so they have, the reason they have been a bit more successful at that is they're a little bit more open in their interpretation of ancestral law or ancestral land rights. And Indonesia is a bit strict about theirs. You have to prove that you have not left the area. You have to have this like continuous habitation of this particular land. And so because of that, it's made it very difficult for communities like the Kasapuan, who are semi-nomadic and often tend to move around with Swidden agriculture, that they have no way of showing that they are in this particular area. So the Philippines does not use that connection to a specific place. It's more open in its idea of what it means to be tied to land. And so they've been pretty open. And Indonesia, a lot of the activists and NGOs within Indonesia have actually used the Philippines as an example. And there's a lot of open communication between NGOs in Indonesia and the Philippines, trying to get a similar system passed in Indonesia. Did I cover all of them? I think I did. Do you guys want to maybe just open it up for discussion? Oh,
sure. Do you have additional slides that after this, or should we?
Nope.
Okay.
We're just open, yeah, for discussion. I can answer that one. what is the shifting cultivation system? What are the key commodities and subsistence crops? There is a system of wet rice agriculture and also dry or rain-fed rice cultivation. I'm getting another feedback, sorry. Are you guys, you can hear me fine?
Yeah, I'm not hearing any feedback.
Okay. So they have two different systems. The community really views the wet rice agriculture as being introduced by the Dutch during that the cultivation system and afterwards. And so the Dutch, essentially tried to force the community into wet rice agriculture for the primary reason that it is more productive. And so a lot of those Swidden cultivation systems were forgotten by some communities. Some of them still practice Swidden agriculture. The particular community where I was working does both, but it's at a much smaller scale for the Swidden than it is for the wet rice agriculture. Pretty much every family does wet rice agriculture, but that is mainly to pay taxes. They pay taxes in rice, and so that's what they use to pay taxes. But almost, I would say, probably all, if not 90%, if not all, of the Swidden rice is used to feed the family. So there are different varieties that are not easily bought, and so they prefer to eat those rather than or donate them back to the community and the king rather than selling those or using them for taxes. Other commodities, they do a lot of farming. A really interesting development is that the community in the last, so when I was there in 2016, they had sent 2 of their younger community members to Japan to work with an indigenous group, an NGO that works with indigenous community members around the world. And they taught them, production methods for agricultural products. And these 2 young men went back to the village, and I keep up with the community members, and they're now doing coffee production and then selling the coffee beans. And they're also doing a lot of veggie production, so leafy greens and such. And they're using that for the community, but also for selling. The community before, when I was there, was very dependent. They weren't growing very many crops. And so, except for rice. And so the initiative to start growing more vegetables was because they just didn't have it available, and they wanted them, but they were dependent on this one single truck that would come once a week with veggies, and they were the last stop for the truck. So they would often get the very worm-eaten and beat-up veggies, and so they decided to do something about it. And so I think that's a really interesting development in agriculture that's been happening in the community.
So you're not seeing the kind of tree crops, tree commodity crops that you're seeing in a lot of places across Indonesia?
For example?
Like the cacaos and the coffees and more single
yes.
cash-based kind of commodities.
Yes, the coffee is the main one. I haven't seen the cacao yet. Trying to think if there are others that I noticed. There were a lot of tree planting initiatives, but they were not for commodity crops. They were for deforestation and reforestation projects that were sponsored by NGOs. And so, unfortunately, a lot of those projects had a, really good heart, but they would bring in species of trees that weren't native to the area, or they would, plant the pine trees because they're quick growing. And you can actually, when you drive in and out of the community, you can see these huge stands of evergreen trees. And those are projects, reforestation projects, previous ones. And the community members are like, I don't know, there's a big big group of pine trees over there. We don't know what, they just told us to plant them and they paid us money to plant them. So we planted them for them. So, I mean, there's just like a really interesting disconnect between, you know, forestation and what it means to reforest an area between the NGO and the community.
That's really interesting. You also mentioned the role of gold, right? Gold mining in certain areas. How does that factor into, you know, rice cultivation systems and swidens and, you know, these restoration projects in a national park? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So in some of my other research, I looked at what it means to have power. And what I was finding a bit is that there are different types of power. So that, you know, some communities have very strong power within the adat system, and there were other communities that had very strong political power within the statutory system. And the difference for that over and over again seemed to be their access to gold mining. So communities that were further removed from gold mining were also further removed from development projects, and oftentimes were much stronger in the adat system. Those that were closer to, you know, roads for transportation for gold, you know, communication systems, that whatnot, that those communities had very strong political power with NGOs and with the statutory system, National Park Office, that sort of thing. But they did not have very strong, you know, presence within the adat system. And so it was really, you know, it's interesting to look at the way that gold and access to natural resources plays into that type of power. There was also, I had mentioned kind of at the very beginning, there were also instances of it's called minimata. It's a long-term exposure to mercury. And that's how the community members are not going out and mining their own gold. They're using the tailings left over from large-scale mining, and they collect the bags and then take them to their home and use ball mills. Ball mills, they have, you know, you put in mercury in these balls within these drums, and they turn it for maybe like, you know, 7 to 12 hours, 24 hours, you know, it kind of depends. But the more mercury you put in there, it binds all those really small pieces of gold together. And so the more mercury you use, the more gold you get out of it. So you can see what's happening here is that, you know, people are getting short-term wealth at the expense of their long-term health, because the more mercury you use, the more gold you can collect from those tailings. And, you know, it's a whole other story when you look at where they're getting that mercury. There's a lot of black market sales that go on. You know, they're not even really supposed to be able to buy it. So where are they getting it? Who's selling it to them? Marina Welker at Cornell has done a lot with this research. So if you're interested in, you know, looking more at the gold mining, I think Nancy Lee Peluso is also working on some gold mining. And there's also another IFAS fellow, Matt Wade, I believe that's his name. Anas, is that correct? He's done work on gold mining also in West Java. So there's a lot of people out there working on that if you're interested.
Yes, it's Matthew Wade.
I'm sorry, what?
Yes, it is Matthew Wade.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you. How are NGOs playing, you know, the role in assisting adat communities to manage their land currently? You know, with anything, there's really good ones and there's really bad ones. I don't want to name names, but there are certainly some organizations that are working very hard to take gender and the environment into consideration. There are other NGOs that are not, and continue to maybe reinforce power structures that are already in place and work those to their benefit. So I think it's really important not to assume that NGOs have the best interest of the community in mind, because that's not always the case. Sometimes they have their own mission. And so, sometimes community members don't want to work with the NGOs. This particular community is, some of my other work looks at participatory mapping. So how community members are creating maps. So participatory mapping is generally facilitated through NGOs, but some of these communities do not want to work with the NGOs for whatever reason. And so I looked at how they were creating these maps of their territorial claims, even though they're not working with an NGO. So, the use of Ratu Plaza within Jakarta to buy counterfeit software, or using bartered handheld GPS units, just a number of different ways. And also just that the technology is much more accessible nowadays. You can get Indonesian language packages for equipment, that sort of thing, for software, for ArcGIS. And so, how communities have managed to be able to make territorial claims on their own without NGOs. Another one. Go ahead, Micah. I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. If these questions are still if you're still going through the questions, keep going. This is really interesting. I have some follow-up questions, but let's prioritize the Jamboard.
All right. Do you think adat cultivation can thrive without any interference from the state? Absolutely. I think the question is, do I think adat cultivation can thrive with interference from the state? I would say that adat cultivation systems, and whether that's Sweden or some of the other different versions as well, ceremonies that take place within the fields, even within wet rice agriculture. I think the biggest threat to that is, over the years, the way that it's been stigmatized outside of the community. The community doesn't see anything wrong with it for the most part. And so, I think it's terms like slash and burn have really stigmatized adat cultivation systems within, Southeast Asia. And so, maybe that is probably the bigger question, is, can it survive with interference from the state? I don't see any more unless there's other ones coming in, but.
Okay, I think that's great. I think we should take another 15 minutes. If there's questions, additional questions, maybe people weren't able to access the Jamboard, you could use the chat at this point, or raise your hand. If you have burning questions, I have a couple of follow-up themes that I think are really interesting, particularly in the context of who's in attendance today. We started off this is a continuation of the theme of the legacy of colonial law, right? And I thought your point about the reaction, the influence of the Japanese occupation in 42, 43, and then how then the Dutch came in afterward, or the idea is they went back to the Dutch system. I think that was really interesting. And obviously, the statutory system has changed over time, like Reformasi has created decentralized governance, et cetera. And in the last 10 years, a lot of your research, our research, has focused on the influence of this constitutional court decision, the role of adat in forestry policy making, agrarian reform, social forestry, these things. So my question is, what might be the legacy of this era of the last 10 years, right? Of this, these adat recognition systems, when we're looking back to the new trajectories that might have been established or created from this recent period of recognizing adat law, and you already alluded a little bit to what needs to happen in the future, right, in terms of how recognition of adat works. So can you talk a little bit about what the legacy of this system or these recent legal trends might be for the future?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Fisher, for the tough question. Asking the hard ones. Yeah, so I didn't really talk about it within this presentation, but the bulk of my research is centered around a constitutional court ruling called MK35, and that is to recognize ownership of lands for indigenous communities that were previously labeled as state lands. So it's really trying to get at this idea of previously it had been kind of confiscated from indigenous communities in order to create national parks. And so they're trying to, maybe reinstate claims by indigenous communities. The problem with that, though, is that national parks aren't eligible for MK35. So, there's a limited amounts of land that can actually be returned to communities that they view as their own. So anybody who, any community that's living within a national park still has no chance at regaining any sort of land rights. And as what that might be playing out in the future, does that mean that indigenous rights are pitted against conservation? And yes, that does happen. That very much happens. And it's a bit of a conundrum that even I don't know how that plays out in the future. Like, who do you prioritize? Do you prioritize the rights of indigenous communities to, live a healthy, happy life with secure rights to natural resources? Or do you prioritize conservation and the rights of, all Indonesians to be able to visit conservation zones? And I'm really torn. I don't know how that's going to play out. I think maybe I'm really happy I'm not in charge of the Indonesian forestry sector and have to make those decisions, because it is a really difficult, I think we need to acknowledge the difficulty of the situation. I had another thought on that and I lost it. So if it comes back to me, I'll circle back around. But yeah, in the future, I think that it's, there's always, it's difficult to prioritize anyone's rights. And as for decentralization and centralization of, how that kind of fluctuates within Indonesian law, and the decentralization has really strengthened adat systems. It's, whether that is intentional or unintentional, because of so much ambiguity and confusion at the national level. And there's no real, strict set of national laws for forestry that's strengthened adat systems. And in the future, I kind of hesitate within this research to really present that finding, because I feel like I'm advocating for, or not, maybe I'm giving the central government the idea that a stronger system would, tear down adat systems. And I don't think that's what I hope happens at all. So, there's a lot of different legacies coming out of this particular era. And I'm just as interested in seeing how it plays out as probably a lot of people are.
Yeah, it's sorry to throw tough questions. I mean, looking into the researchers don't often think about looking into the crystal ball of the future, right? I mean, there's not much data to choose from in the future. But I think it is a key question that I think is in a lot of people's minds, which way to the trajectories of these new legal developments, where they go. The other thing that I was really struck by your presentation that I think is really interesting, and some of the readings that we've assigned in our course are related to gender. So you touched on it briefly in passing, but tell us more about, engaging on the gender dimensions of working in Indigenous communities. You mentioned how how some issues might get reinforced with different systems, and what are the things to be mindful. I guess it's also kind of part of a methodological question too, in terms of how maybe the researchers present today think about engaging on gender issues on these sorts of topics.
Yeah, there's so as you're approaching research with ethnographic research, there's this idea of the emic and the etic. So the internal viewpoint of it versus the external. And so with a lot of the issues of gender, I really had to step outside the researcher and say, I'm approaching this from my Western perspective. I'm approaching this as a woman, educated woman from America, and I have to step outside that, and I have to let go of those perspectives and really listen to the community. And so part of that was really a struggle with gender, because maybe some of the things with inheritance or of land, ownership of land, or even use, official use rights of land were very gendered. They went to the, primarily the male within the communities. And I'd be lying if I said that didn't bother me. But it's, like I said, you have to step outside of that and maybe just, approach it and listen to the community as they tell you their stories. And so that was part of it for me, is listening to, women as they were talking about different rights that they had, different spaces that they, had access to. It was a really interesting space also for me. So looking at that emic perspective, that I was not a traditional female in it. I had access to perspectives and interview subjects that traditionally a woman in this community would not have had access to. I almost was somewhere in between a male and a female. And so, that's a methodological thing. In some instances, it cut me off from both female and male community members, but in other instances, it also gave me access to male spaces and female spaces. So for example, there is a yearly harvest party, and traditionally male elders are go to this house, and everybody comes in to pay their taxes. And you pay taxes based on many different things: the number of family members, animals, motorcycles owned, fields, harvest. Like, there's a lot of different ways that they count taxes, but it was an all male space. The only females that were in there were usually just cooking. And I was allowed to sit in there, look at receipts, and, look at how they calculated taxes, all of this that were traditionally male spaces. But then at the end, I was also asked to take all the dirty dishes back to the kitchen. So you can see how it's like this very weird space that I was allowed to exist in. And I, that's, more of a methodological question or methodological answer, I think, than gender within the community. But it did allow me insight into the unique perspectives of both communities, but then also cut me off at other times. So, yeah. Sorry, I'm gonna grab
It's cold there.
It just got chilly.
Okay. I think that the gender question is really interesting too. You know, I've seen some research from Thailand, especially on communities, how women are maybe not involved in the formal spaces of decision making, but there's all these behind the scenes that happen too. I've always found it challenging to be able to enter spaces that are closed off. So being able to have a foot in both spaces is really interesting. And I think it's something that we all need to be more aware of, especially working with adat communities and forested communities, and how they how decisions are being made, you know, in formal settings and in other settings. Feel free to comment on that. That's just another, I guess, theoretical observation on these gender dimensions. Does anybody have any questions? Apakah ada yang ingin bertanya? Silakan bertanya dalam bahasa Indonesia kalau lebih nyaman. How are we doing on time? Laras, please. We have a couple minutes, I know. Go ahead.
Kita masih ada 12 menit, Pak. Oke.
Okay. Any questions?
Di slide ketiga sepertinya masih ada question.
Okay.
We're opening. Wait. Okay. Satu pertanyaan. One question in the third slide.
Are there any social processes, mechanisms developed in the local community to deliver the adat law into the young generations? Really interesting, this question of generational transfer. What adat will look like, you know, in the future, given so many globalization and trends of development that are being extended into new areas.
Yeah, this is a really interesting process within the community. I found it fascinating. They, you know, things are very much family based. So a lot of these like more powerful families within the community would kind of pass on those roles to their children. And so there was a lot of expectations of children to carry on with this adat law, and they are incorporated and involved from a very, very young age. And I think that's pretty encouraging for, you know, the future of customary law within Indonesia for these communities. You know, however, there is also, it's often considered, you know, this dichotomy between education and adat. And I think that's really unfortunate, because the community members would often refuse further education, sometimes because they didn't have access to it. Like it was very far, and it was either a financial or a, you know, a geographical thing that they just couldn't access higher education, or, you know, even secondary education. But sometimes it was also built into the community adat structure. So there was adat, it was kind of built into it. It was expressed. I'm not sure it was ever, you know, if it's actually part of adat law, but it was very much the belief within the community that if you leave and you accept outside education, you renounce your membership of the community. And so I feel like that's really unfortunate. But with that, those younger males that were sent to Japan in that example, I think that's a case of more of like informal education processes that the community is okay with. And so I think that's kind of encouraging that they're allowing adat and education to coexist in a way. After the adat community is acknowledged by the government, do you think their welfare income will increase? Yeah, so this is, and some of you might be aware, some indigenous communities within Indonesia are recognized by the government and some are not for various reasons. This is not unique to Indonesia. I live in Seattle, and there is a group here called the Duwamish, and we are on their ancestral lands, but they had recognition from the federal government for 2 days, and then it was rescinded, and they are still 10 years on trying to fight to get back their federal recognition, because there are a lot of benefits that go with being actually acknowledged by the government. And this is the same thing within the Kasapuan. So it's very strange. They're all one community called the Kasapuan, but there's all of these different kind of like branches and family groups. And one of those family groups is recognized by the government, and the other ones are not. And so that particular community has worked very closely with NGOs, and the NGOs helped them get recognition from the federal government, and therefore their claims for land rights have been much stronger than some of the other communities within the Kasapuan. And so their land rights are much stronger because of that. Then, so I think there is some benefits that go with being acknowledged, but at the same time, as soon as you acknowledge something, you draw attention to it. And so maybe in some cases, it's kind of detrimental to the community to have that that spotlight on them, and they're kind of left alone a little bit. And they're, even with rights, with recognition, same with ADA, same with formalized land rights, there are drawbacks to having that like very formalized recognition. You solidify things in a way that is, they're much more unmovable. And so the community does fear that a bit. So it goes kind of both ways, I guess. Gender approach, think between Western and traditional perspectives in Indonesia. Different perspectives are sometimes very polarized. How should we consolidate this differentiation in the context of methodology? Oh, I don't know. That's a difficult question. It's really difficult, I mean, I think even as an outside researcher, and, if an Indonesian would go into this community, that there are times when an Indonesian would understand more, because maybe they would have, more language fluency, or they would understand some nuances that I wouldn't understand. But then again, sometimes there are cases where inside researchers carry very particular sets of baggage with them. And so there were researchers that would come in that were from the community or from Indonesia, and sometimes the community would bulk against them coming in because they are from a particular group outside, or, maybe they think they're trying to get some insider information in order to harm the community, or, they think they're a spy for an NGO or something. So, it's really interesting to think about the ways that outsiders versus insiders, male versus female, and maybe we don't need to think of it as anyone having the right information or the wrong information. Maybe we need to think about it as the different lenses that we're all viewing the situation from, and we all have something to bring to the table. I think that's maybe the best way we can think about, methodologically about this.
One more question just came in.
I don't see another one, sorry.
Oh, I guess it was just being moved. Okay, I think we're coming up on time here. If you have some closing, remarks, maybe, key questions about, where this research is headed, what people should be focused on, what new research questions might be interesting, feel free to share with us. And after that, I will turn it over to Laras to give some announcements and talk about some of our upcoming events. I really think that today really really fit in nicely with kind of the trajectory of the issues that we've been raising. I think you've really moved along our collective thinking, the research location, the topics, the theoretical, empirical, and methodological issues are so interesting. So thank you for joining us today. And yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. For the question about where this is heading, I would love to go back to Indonesia, but with the pandemic, and I think it's really hard for outside researchers to get into Indonesia to do research now, and so in the future, I'm not sure that how much follow-up I can do in a professional sense. I'm actually looking to start looking at similar issues within indigenous communities in the United States. So like I mentioned with the Duwamish, but also other, other indigenous communities and tribal communities, Alaskan natives, also have very similar issues with access to land and natural resources. So in the future, I'm hoping to kind of look at some of those. And also with Southeast Asia diaspora communities. So here in Seattle, there's a huge Hmong community from Laos and Thailand and northern Vietnam, and they do a lot of agricultural activities in different places across the United States. So I'm also interested in looking at, Southeast Asian diaspora communities and agricultural practices. So, yeah. Hopefully I'll see some of you along the way. I'm, again, my email, I'm open to question and feedback through that as well. And I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Great, thanks once again. And we'll definitely pass on additional messages and hope to carry on the conversation going forward. Mbak Laras, silakan.
Baik, terima kasih Pak Maika. Thank you very much for Dr. Rebecca Darominarcek for the insightful sharings with us, and thank you very much for joining us today. Mungkin ini bagi Bapak Ibu tadi sudah disampaikan oleh Ibu Rebecca begitu. Mungkin kalau ada yang tertarik mungkin dengan isu-isu yang tadi beliau sampaikan, bisa ada diskusi lanjutan begitu atau ingin berdiskusi lebih banyak lagi begitu. Nah, mungkin kami ingin menyampaikan beberapa hal juga, mungkin remind lagi bahwa tadi ada conference, ya, mungkin kita remind lagi bagi Bapak Ibu yang ingin tertarik untuk submit your best abstract gitu, penelitiannya silahkan join di conference IVIS and Michigan State University, dan akan ditutup untuk abstract submission bulan ini tanggal 31 Maret 2021. Kemudian juga jangan lupa, ini juga Bapak Ibu sekalian sepertinya banyak juga peserta dari online course. Jadi kita untuk online course berikutnya mungkin keep in mind. Jadi kita nanti sudah masuk ke tema-tema sektoral begitu in the context on environmental governance. Jadi kita nanti ada Prof Yudi yang akan menyampaikan dan judulnya sangat unik begitu ya. Saya juga nggak tahu ini maksudnya seperti apa begitu. Mungkin kita harus join begitu course-nya, dan ini course-nya kebetulan juga akan kita streamingkan via YouTube channel, tapi tidak di Sebijak Institute, di Forest and Society begitu. Jadi silahkan bagi Bapak Ibu yang di luar peserta online course bisa join di YouTube channel Forest and Society seperti itu. Dan mungkin dari saya terima kasih banyak, dan sebelum kita tutup kami ingatkan kembali juga untuk peserta bisa mengisi presensi yang ada di chat box. Panitia bisa meng-up lagi untuk presensinya, dan kami harapkan Bapak Ibu juga bisa memberikan feedback seperti itu. Jadi mungkin Bapak Ibu memiliki mungkin isu ini yang menarik atau seperti apa bagusnya format webinar atau course kita, silakan disampaikan melalui feedback. Mungkin dari saya cukup demikian. Pak Maika, terima kasih atas moderasinya, dan juga Ibu Rebecca. Terima kasih, thank you very much. Dan ini sudah malam mungkin di Washington, seperti itu. Good evening, selamat istirahat begitu. Mungkin itu saja. Jika ada tambahan, Pak Maika.
Biasanya Sebijak Institute suka foto dulu. Jadi kalau mau memuatkan waktu untuk foto sebentar, kami juga senang melihat semua tersenyum di layar, toh.
Baik. Mungkin ini biar Bapak Ibu nanti kita dokumentasikan di sosial media Sebijak Institute. Mungkin kita ada 3 kali ya. Ini ada 46 participants. Saya hitung. 1, 2, 3. Sekali lagi 1, 2, 3. Last capture 1, 2, 3. Baik, terima kasih Bapak Ibu sekalian, Pak Yosef, Pak Anas dari IV, saya Dr. Rebecca, thank you very much, Pak Maika dan juga Bapak Ibu peserta sekalian. Mungkin itu dari saya, kurang lebihnya mohon maaf. Sampai jumpa di hari Senin di online course Environment, Development, and Governance. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam. See you all next time. Makasih.
Terima kasih.
Terima kasih.
Ibu Saida.
Mbak Laras, can we use the link at the end for
Okay. Yeah.
streaming YouTube? Can we turn that off?